thank you very much, everybody. I want to start my talk today, actually, with a quote from Einstein. So, the world as we have created it is a process of our thinking. It cannot be changed without changing our thinking. This could not be more true in terms of how we need to adapt to the climate crisis. While politicians negotiate and procrastinate on how to respond, we are already most likely locked into about 2 degrees of warming. Just look at the hurricanes in Mozambique and the Bahamas. The consequences are devastating. We need to reimagine how we adapt and build resilience to the climate crisis. Throughout history, humanity has always faced changing threats, risks, and upheavals. But the crisis confronting today's policy, business, and community leaders is that the rate, frequency, and intensity of the climate impacts and the subsequent risks are changing radically. Climate impacts are transformational, shifting socioeconomic, political, environmental, and technological systems, with the potential to radically change societies and alter the status quo. We have a choice, though, if these climate-driven transformations are to be either positive or negative. Yet our current framing is that countries need only be cognizant of climate impacts and adaptation responses within their own borders. But we live in an interconnected and interdependent world. Our human and environmental systems are just that, they're systems, and climate change presents a systems risk. As such, climate risks are transboundary, requiring us to think how we respond through adaptation. So what do we mean by transboundary climate risks? Well, just as people, goods, and services cross borders, so too do the impacts of climate change and our subsequent adaptation responses. A localized flood occurring more frequently and intensely disrupts a global supply chain, which in turn affects consumers thousands of miles away. An adaptation response to increase irrigation by tapping into a transboundary river affects a shared ecosystem and shifts sensitive political dynamics across the region. So let's take one real-world example. Let me take you back to Thailand in 2011. When climate-related flooding hit, there were not only severe domestic consequences, but there were also significant shocks to the supply chains of Japanese firms, which in turn had knock-on impacts to production in Malaysia, Vietnam, and Indonesia, impacting people's livelihoods. Thailand's adaptation response was to curtail rice imports to international markets, which could have led to price increases with severe impacts on food security in many of those rice importing countries, such as Senegal, where now rice accounts for more than a third of calorific intake. This is why transboundary climate risks matter. They matter because countries are telling us they matter. And it's not just 1 or 2 countries who are saying this. There are many, from Bangladesh to Burundi, from Afghanistan to Angola, from Sudan to Somalia, raising issues from shared water resources to displacement. They matter because no one country is immune, and no one country can address these alone. They matter because recognizing and accounting for these risks will be critical for the realization of Agenda 2030 and to meet the global challenge of adaptation as outlined in the Paris Agreement. We need governments, multilateral organizations, donors and financiers to hear this. So let's go back to Einstein for a moment. The world as we have created it is a process of our thinking. It cannot be changed without changing our thinking. On multiple levels, actually, humanity has failed to heed this advice. But this is certainly true in terms of our adaptation efforts. And our thinking is still based on outdated ideas. First, adaptation is a failure of mitigation. Second, mitigation happens globally, while adaptation happens locally. Adaptation is still overwhelmingly framed as a national to local concern, implying that its scope and effect remain primarily within national borders. Third, Adaptation measures are costly and offer limited return on investment. This thinking needs to change. But if you change how you think about something, it follows that you have to change how you act. Our thinking fundamentally frames who we are as people, how we see the world, and most importantly, the world we want to see. So how does our thinking need to change? Adaptation is not a failure of mitigation. We have to adapt because we're already experiencing at least 1 degree of warming. We need both mitigation and adaptation. For example, low-carbon development and transition to low-carbon futures have to be climate resilient. Adaptation actions can support economic growth by accounting for and anticipating the impacts of climate change. And most critically, adaptation is required not only at the local level, but as our country's examples show, adaptation efforts are needed across borders. The stakes are so high, yet our current adaptation plans often fail to recognise or account for transboundary risks or our global interdependence. So our call to action today is Adaptation Without Borders. Adaptation measures that are fit for purpose in terms of addressing the lived reality, present and future, of transboundary climate risks, and one that wholeheartedly embraces the principles of do no harm and leave no one behind. And this is why we have launched the Adaptation Without Borders initiative. The plan for the initiative is to create visibility of these issues, gather the evidence to support decision-making, build connections and inspire action. Most importantly, we need to build a coalition of the willing who understand that sovereignty is best protected through strengthening multilateral cooperation and governments. If we ignore and don't address transboundary climate risks, we run the risk of potentially redistributing these vulnerabilities between countries and groups. So let's change our thinking and adapt without borders. Thank you very much.